The Secret Train. Part 1. The Arrival. Clara walked along the empty street, her hands shoved deep into her coat pockets. It was late, and the air was cold enough to make her breath visible. She'd had another terrible day, the kind where nothing goes right, and you wonder why you even bother. Clara felt restless, unsure of where to go, but unwilling to head home just yet. The thought of staring at the same walls in her tiny apartment made her stomach tighten. She found herself wandering into unfamiliar streets. The streetlights were old and dim, their yellow glow barely cutting through the darkness. Ahead, she spotted something strange, a train station. It was small and run down, with a cracked sign that read Station 43. Clara had never noticed it before, even though she thought she knew the city well. Station 43, she murmured. Since when does this exist? There were no benches or ticket machines, just a single empty platform. She hesitated, looking around for signs of life. There was nothing but the soft rustle of wind through the nearby trees. Clara felt a chill run down her spine, but she ignored it and stepped closer to the platform. She wasn't sure why, but something about the station drew her in. She stood there for what felt like minutes, her breath fogging in the cold air. Just as she was about to turn and leave, she heard it, a low, deep rumble in the distance. Clara froze, listening. The sound grew louder, accompanied by a soft vibration under her feet. A beam of light cut through the darkness, and then she saw it, a sleek black train gliding toward the platform. The train slowed to a smooth stop, its glowing windows casting soft light across the cracked platform. Clara stared, her heart pounding. It didn't look like any train she'd ever seen. The windows shimmered faintly, as if they were alive, and the doors slid open without a sound. The train waited. It didn't honk or announce its presence. It simply sat there, the open doors like an invitation. Clara glanced around, expecting to see other people. There were none. The street was empty, the platform silent except for the faint hum coming from the train. She took a hesitant step closer. The inside of the train looked warm, with soft golden lights and rows of plush seats. Clara's gut told her to turn around and leave, but something about the train pulled her in. It wasn't curiosity exactly, more like a strange, unexplainable need to step inside. Clara hesitated at the door. "This is crazy," she muttered under her breath. But as she stood there, the cold night seemed to press against her, and the train felt like the only escape. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The warmth hit her immediately, wrapping around her like a blanket. The golden lights felt soft on her eyes, and the air was completely still. The doors slid shut behind her with a quiet hiss, making her jump. She turned, but there was no handle, no way to open them again. "Too late now," she said softly. The train began to move. It started so smoothly that Clara barely felt it, gliding forward as if it were floating. She looked around. The train car was empty, with rows of seats stretching out in both directions. The seats were covered in dark green fabric, and the walls had a sleek, polished look. Everything felt too clean, too perfect. She picked a seat near the window and sat down, glancing outside. The station was already gone, replaced by darkness. Clara frowned. There was no city, no streetlights, no buildings, just an endless black void outside the train. The only light came from the glowing windows of the train itself. "What is this place?" she whispered. Clara looked down the train car, trying to see if she was alone. At first, it seemed empty, but then she spotted someone sitting far ahead, their back turned to her. The figure was completely still, not even shifting in their seat. Clara hadn't seen them when she got on, and she wondered how she had missed them. She stood up slowly, gripping the edge of her seat. "Excuse me?" she called out. The figure didn't respond. They didn't even move. Clara felt her chest tighten. She wasn't sure why, but something about the figure seemed wrong. Their head was tilted slightly to the side, as though they were listening for something. She sat back down quickly, her palms sweaty. "Get a grip," she told herself. "It's just another passenger." Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the figure wasn't quite right. The train's motion changed. It wasn't smooth anymore. It sped up, the hum growing louder as the train seemed to rush forward. Clara looked out the window, but the black void outside hadn't changed. She pressed her face to the glass, searching for anything. A building, a tree, even a light in the distance. There was nothing. Her stomach turned. It felt like the train wasn't taking her anywhere, just speeding through an endless nothingness. She glanced back at the other passenger, but they hadn't moved. Their head was still tilted, their posture rigid. "What kind of train is this?" Clara said aloud. Her voice sounded small in the quiet. Suddenly, the train began to slow. The change was so abrupt that Clara had to grab the edge of her seat to steady herself. The hum softened, and the train glided to a stop. Clara's heart raced as she stared out the window, hoping to see something, anything. What she saw didn't make sense. Outside the train was a forest, but it wasn't like any forest she had ever seen. The trees glowed faintly, their trunks and branches shining with soft green and blue light. The ground was covered in a mist that moved as though it were alive, curling around the roots of the trees. The doors slid open, and cool air filled the train car. It smelled like damp earth and rain. Clara leaned forward, staring out at the glowing forest. She felt an urge to step outside to see the forest up close, but then she glanced at the other passenger. They were still sitting perfectly still, their back to her. They hadn't moved at all. The doors stayed open, waiting. Clara gripped the edge of her seat, torn between her curiosity and the uneasy feeling crawling up her spine. "Where does this train go?" she whispered. Part 2, the first glimpse of mystery. Clara stared out at the glowing forest. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. The trees shined softly, their light spreading a blue and green glow over the misty ground. The mist itself seemed alive, curling and shifting like it had its own thoughts. It was beautiful, but something about it felt off. The train doors stayed open, as if waiting for her to step outside. Clara looked down the aisle at the other passenger. They hadn't moved. Their head was still tilted slightly, facing the window. She couldn't tell if they were even breathing. "Are you getting off?" she called out, her voice shaking a little. It felt strange to break the silence. The passenger didn't respond. Clara felt a chill creep up her spine. She looked back at the glowing forest, her heart pounding. It felt like the trees were watching her, even though that was impossible. She wanted to move, to do something, but her body felt frozen. Clara gripped the armrests of her seat. Her mind raced. Part of her wanted to explore the forest, to see if it was real. But another part of her, the stronger part, was terrified. This wasn't normal. Forests didn't glow, mist didn't move like that, and no train she had ever been on had stops like this. The doors made a soft sound like a sigh. Clara glanced at them nervously. "Not this time," she whispered to herself. After what felt like forever, the doors slid closed. The air shifted and the train began to move again. Clara let out a shaky breath and leaned back in her seat. The glowing forest disappeared into the darkness outside. The train picked up speed, gliding smoothly through the black void. Clara tried to calm herself, but the unease in her chest wouldn't go away. She glanced down the aisle, back at the passenger. They still hadn't moved. Clara stood up slowly, gripping the back of her seat for balance. She wanted to look at the other passenger more closely. Maybe if she saw their face, this would all feel less strange. "Hey," she called out as she walked closer. "Are you okay?" When she was just a few steps away, the passenger turned. The movement was sudden, too quick, and Clara froze. The face that looked back at her wasn't right. The passenger's eyes were wide, too wide, and their expression didn't match their body. They stared at her with a strange, blank smile, their head tilted at an unnatural angle. Clara's breath caught in her throat. "I," she stammered. She didn't know what to say. The passenger's smile faded. Slowly they turned back toward the window, as if she wasn't even there. Clara backed away, her heart pounding. She sat down in her seat, gripping the armrest tightly. "This isn't real," she whispered. "It can't be real." The train began to slow again. Clara's stomach flipped. She didn't know if she could handle another strange stop, but she couldn't leave. The doors were sealed, and the train kept moving forward. The hum of the train grew softer as it pulled into the next stop. This time, Clara didn't look out the window right away. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply to calm herself. When she finally opened them, what she saw made her heart skip a beat. Outside the train was a city. It wasn't like any city she'd ever seen. The buildings were tall and shiny, but they weren't straight. They twisted and bent, their walls curving and folding in impossible ways. Lights flickered in the windows, but they didn't look warm or inviting. They looked cold, almost like they were watching her. The doors slid open again, and Clara shivered. The air outside felt heavy, like it was pressing against her. She stayed in her seat, gripping the armrests. The other passengers stood up. Clara's breath caught as she watched them walk toward the open doors. Their movements were stiff, almost robotic. Without a word, they stepped off the train and disappeared into the strange city. "Wait!" Clara called out, standing up. She ran to the door, but by the time she got there, the passenger was gone. The city stretched out in front of her, silent and still. She thought about stepping off just for a moment, but the heavy air made her chest feel tight. It felt like the city didn't want her there. The train doors slid closed. The hum returned and the train started moving again. Clara sank back into her seat, shaking. For the first time, Clara realized she was completely alone. The other passenger was gone, and there was no one else in sight. The train car felt bigger, emptier. The golden lights above her flickered slightly, casting soft shadows on the walls. She rubbed her hands together, trying to shake the cold that had settled into her bones. "What is this place?" she whispered. "Where is this train taking me?" The train picked up speed again. Outside, the darkness seemed thicker, heavier. Clara stared out the window, hoping to see something, anything that would make sense. But there was nothing. Just endless blackness. Then far ahead, she saw a light. It was small at first, just a speck in the distance. As the train moved closer, the light grew brighter. It wasn't warm like sunlight. It was sharp and cold, like the glow of a neon sign. Clara felt her heart race. She didn't know what was waiting for her at the next stop, but she knew she wasn't ready. The train car was silent, except for the low hum of the engine. But as Clara sat there, she started to hear something else. Soft whispers, too faint to understand. She looked around, trying to find the source of the sound, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her like the wind. They didn't sound like voices exactly, more like echoes of words that had already been spoken. Clara pressed her hands over her ears, but the whispers didn't stop. They weren't coming from outside. They were in her head. "Stop it," she said, her voice shaking. "Stop!" The train jolted suddenly, and the whispers stopped. Clara lowered her hands slowly, her heart pounding. She looked around the car, but nothing had changed. The golden lights still flickered softly, and the seats were still empty. Clara took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The train was still moving, faster now, rushing toward the next stop. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew one thing for sure. This was no ordinary train. Part 3: The Changing Train. Clara sat in her seat, staring out the window. The dark void outside was endless, and the train moved through it so smoothly it barely felt like it was moving at all. Her hands gripped the armrests tightly, and her heart wouldn't stop racing. The strange city, the glowing forest, the eerie passenger, none of it made sense. She looked around the train car. The golden lights above flickered slightly, casting soft shadows on the empty seats. It felt colder now, and Clara rubbed her arms for warmth. "This can't be real," she whispered to herself. "It's just a weird dream, that's all." But deep down, she didn't believe it. Everything felt too sharp, too vivid to be a dream. The train felt quieter now that she was alone. The steady hum of the engine had faded, replaced by a strange stillness. Clara glanced down the aisle, hoping to see another passenger, but the car was empty. It felt bigger somehow, like the space had stretched while she wasn't looking. She stood up and walked slowly down the aisle. Her shoes made soft sounds against the floor, the only noise in the entire car. She stopped halfway and turned to look back at her seat. It felt farther away than it should have been. "What's happening?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head and sat back down. Her chest felt tight, like something was pressing on her. The golden lights above flickered again, longer this time. For a moment she thought they might go out completely, but they steadied again. Clara stared straight ahead, trying to stay calm. But then she noticed something strange. A door had appeared at the far end of the train car. She was sure it hadn't been there before. It was small and plain, with no handle, and it seemed to hum softly, like the train itself. Her hands grew clammy as she stared at it. The door wasn't part of the train's design. It looked out of place, almost like it had been added later. But why, and where did it lead? Clara tried to ignore it, turning her gaze back to the window, but the door seemed to pull her attention. Every time she glanced away, her eyes drifted back to it, as if it were calling her silently. Finally, she stood up, her legs shaking slightly. She walked down the aisle, one step at a time, until she was standing in front of the door. The closer she got, the louder the hum became. It wasn't a threatening sound, but it made her uneasy. She reached out slowly, placing her hand on the door. It was warm to the touch. Before she could decide what to do, the door swung open on its own. Clara stepped back as the door opened. She expected to see another part of the train, a storage room, or maybe another car. But what she saw froze her in place. Inside the room, she saw herself. It wasn't a reflection. It was her, walking through moments from her life. She saw herself as a child, playing in her backyard with her dog. She saw her teenage self sitting in her bedroom, staring at the ceiling after a fight with her parents. She saw herself at work, standing by the coffee machine, looking tired and distant. The room wasn't big, but it seemed to stretch forever. The walls were dark, and the only light came from the glowing scenes playing out in front of her. It felt like watching a movie of her life, but one she hadn't chosen to see. What is this?" Clara whispered. Her voice echoed in the small space, sounding louder than she expected. She stepped inside, her heart pounding. The air felt heavy, and her chest grew tighter with each step. She walked toward one of the scenes, her sitting alone in her apartment, staring at a cold cup of tea. She remembered that day clearly. It had been one of her worst. She had felt lost, like nothing she did mattered. Clara reached out to touch the scene, but as soon as her fingers brushed the light, it vanished. The room dimmed slightly, and the hum around her grew louder. Clara turned back toward the door, but it was gone. The room was now sealed, with no way out. Her breathing quickened as she turned in circles, trying to find an exit. The glowing scenes flickered, then disappeared one by one, leaving her in darkness. The hum grew louder, almost like a whisper now. Clara pressed her hands over her ears, but the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was in her head. "You shouldn't have come in here," a voice whispered, soft and distant. Clara spun around, but no one was there. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice shaking. The room didn't answer, but the hum faded slightly. Then the door reappeared. Clara ran to it, pushing it open with trembling hands. She stumbled back into the train car, gasping for air. The train car looked the same, but it felt different. The air was heavier, and the golden light seemed dimmer. Clara slumped into her seat, her hands shaking. She looked back at the door, but it was gone again, as if it had never been there. She pressed her hands against her face, trying to steady her breathing. "This isn't happening," she whispered. "I'm just tired. That's all, I'm tired." But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The train wasn't normal. It wasn't taking her anywhere. It was keeping her here. And now, it felt like it was watching her. Clara looked around the car, her eyes darting to every corner. For the first time, she noticed tiny changes. The seats seemed closer together, the aisle narrower. The golden lights flickered again, and she thought she heard a faint sound, like the train was breathing. This place is alive, she thought. It's alive and it knows I'm here. She gripped the armrests tightly, her nails digging into the fabric. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The train slowed again. Clara's head snapped toward the window, and her heart sank. The next stop was coming. Part 4. A conversation with the unsettling. The train slowed again, and Clara sat frozen in her seat. She didn't want to move, didn't want to look out the window. But something pulled at her curiosity. Slowly, she turned her head and peeked outside. The train had stopped in a strange place. The ground was flat and gray, like stone, but it didn't look solid. It shimmered, almost like water, but it didn't move. The sky above was dark, with no stars or moon. Instead, there were small lights floating in the air, like tiny fireflies. They flickered softly, lighting up the strange world. Clara leaned closer to the window. The lights floated in groups, forming shapes that almost looked like faces, but not quite. She shivered. The train doors slid open, and cold air rushed in, making her gasp. She stared at the open doors, her hands gripping the armrests tightly. She didn't want to leave the train. Not here. The place felt wrong, like it wasn't meant for her. But then she heard something behind her, a soft rustling sound. Clara turned her head slowly. At first, she thought the train car was still empty. But then she saw it, a figure sitting in one of the seats near the back. It hadn't been there before. She was sure of it. The figure looked strange. Its body was thin, almost too thin, and it wore a long black coat. Its face was hard to see, hidden in shadows. Clara's heart raced as she stared at it. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just sat there, facing her. She swallowed hard and looked back at the open doors. The cold air was making her shiver, but the strange figure was even more unsettling. "What do I do?" she whispered to herself. Before she could decide, the train doors slid shut. The air grew warm again, and the train started moving. Clara sat stiffly in her seat, her eyes darting to the figure at the back of the car. It hadn't moved, but she could feel its presence, heavy and cold. She wanted to ignore it, pretend it wasn't there, but then it spoke. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said. Its voice was low and flat, almost like a whisper, but Clara heard it clearly. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure hadn't turned toward her. It was still sitting perfectly still, its face hidden. "What?" Clara managed to say, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond right away. It tilted its head slightly as if thinking. "This train is not for you," it said finally. Clara's chest tightened. "What do you mean? I just got on. I don't know where it's going." The figure let out a soft, dry laugh. It sounded wrong, like a sound that didn't belong to the world. "No one knows where it's going," it said. Clara felt a mix of fear and frustration. She gripped the armrests tightly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Who are you?" she asked. "What is this train?" The figure didn't answer. It tilted its head again, and Clara thought she saw its face shift slightly, like the shadows around it were moving, but she still couldn't see its features clearly. "You should leave," the figure said after a long pause, "before it's too late." Clara frowned. "Leave? How? The doors only open at the stops and those places?" Her voice trailed off as she remembered the glowing forest and the twisted city. "I can't leave, not like this." The figure shifted in its seat, turning slightly toward her. For the first time, Clara felt its gaze, heavy and cold, like a weight pressing down on her. "Then you'll stay," the figure said simply. The lights in the train flickered, and the air grew colder. Clara felt the change immediately. The train no longer felt warm and quiet. It felt alive again, its presence growing stronger. The hum of the engine was louder now, almost like a low growl. Clara looked around, her heart pounding. The walls of the train seemed closer, and the golden lights were dimmer. She turned back to the figure, but it hadn't moved. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Why is this happening?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stood up slowly, its tall, thin body almost brushing the ceiling of the car. Clara pressed herself back into her seat, her breathing quick and shallow. "You'll find out," the figure said, its voice low and cold, "soon." With that, it walked toward the back of the car. Clara watched it go, too scared to move. When it reached the door at the far end, the figure disappeared. The door didn't open, and the figure didn't leave. It just vanished, like smoke fading into the air. The train began to slow again. Clara's heart sank. She didn't want to see what was outside this time. The last stops had been strange enough, and now the train itself was changing. She stared at the floor, refusing to look out the window. But the train seemed to demand her attention. The hum grew louder, and the lights flickered again. Clara looked up, and her eyes were drawn to the window against her will. Outside was a vast desert, stretching as far as she could see. But the desert wasn't made of sand. It was made of mirrors, thousands of them, scattered across the ground. They reflected the dark sky above, creating an endless, dizzying pattern of light and shadow. The train doors slid open, and the cold air rushed in again. Clara stayed in her seat, trembling. She didn't want to step outside. The mirrors looked wrong, like they were showing something more than just reflections. She thought she saw shapes moving in them, shapes that didn't belong. For a moment, Clara thought about what the figure had said. "You should leave," it had told her. But how could she leave here? The desert felt even more dangerous than the train. The doors stayed open, waiting. Clara closed her eyes, gripping the armrests tightly. "Not this time," she whispered. Finally, the doors slid shut. The train started moving again, its hum deep and steady. Clara opened her eyes and let out a shaky breath. The desert of mirrors disappeared into the darkness. Clara slumped in her seat, her body trembling. The train felt colder now, and the golden lights barely lit the car. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stay calm, but the silence was heavier than before, and the air felt thick. She stared down the aisle, hoping the figure wouldn't return, but deep down she knew it wasn't gone. The train itself wasn't just alive, it was watching her, waiting for something. And Clara wasn't sure how much longer she could stay. Part 5, Stops That Don't Make Sense. Clara sat in her seat, holding herself tightly. The train was colder now, and the golden lights above flickered like they might go out at any moment. She kept her eyes fixed on the window, even though there was nothing to see outside but darkness. She couldn't shake the feeling that the train was alive. Every sound it made, every hum and rattle, felt like it was trying to speak to her. The figure's warning echoed in her mind. You should leave before it's too late. But where could she go? The places outside were worse than the train. Forests that glowed, cities that bent, deserts made of mirrors. Nothing made sense, and Clara didn't trust any of it. The train began to slow again, and Clara's stomach turned. She didn't want to see another stop. She didn't want to look out the window. But the train seemed to pull her attention, as if it was forcing her to watch. Through the window, she saw a faint light in the distance. It grew brighter as the train moved closer. Soon, Clara could make out shapes, floating orbs of light, drifting in the air like glowing balloons. The train came to a stop, and the doors slid open. The air outside was warm this time, but Clara didn't feel comforted. The floating lights moved slowly, and they were beautiful, but something about them made her uneasy. They seemed too perfect, their glow too steady. And the longer she looked, the more she thought she saw shapes inside the lights, shadows moving, twisting, watching her. She didn't move from her seat. The train waited, its doors open, but Clara didn't step outside. She couldn't. The doors slid shut, and the train began moving again. This time, it moved faster than before. Clara gripped the armrests, her heart pounding. The hum of the train grew louder, and the car shook slightly as it sped through the darkness. She pressed her face to the window, trying to see what was ahead. The darkness outside seemed thicker now, almost like it was alive. She thought she saw shapes moving in it, but every time she tried to focus, they disappeared. "This train isn't taking me anywhere," Clara whispered to herself. "It's just keeping me here." The train slowed again, and Clara felt her chest tighten. She didn't want to see another stop, but she couldn't help herself. She turned to look out the window. This time, the train had stopped in a wide open field. The ground was flat and dark, but it was dotted with glowing lights. The lights floated just above the ground, flickering softly like tiny candles. They stretched out as far as Clara could see, creating a sea of flickering light. The train doors slid open, and a soft breeze drifted in. It carried a faint smell, something sweet and familiar, like flowers. Clara stood up slowly, her legs shaking. She moved closer to the door, her eyes fixed on the field of lights. The lights flickered in patterns, almost like they were trying to tell her something. She squinted, trying to understand. For a moment, she thought she saw words forming in the flickering lights, but they were gone before she could read them. "Come closer," a soft voice whispered. Clara gasped and stepped back. "Who said that?" she called out. Her voice echoed in the empty train car. The lights in the field flickered again, brighter this time. Clara's breathing quickened. She turned and ran back to her seat, throwing herself into it. The train doors slid shut, and the train began moving again. The train moved faster now, its hum loud and steady. Clara stared at the floor, trying to calm herself, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking, and her chest felt tight. The train slowed again, and Clara let out a shaky breath. She didn't want to look out the window, but her curiosity got the better of her. The train had stopped in front of a vast black sea. The water was still, its surface so smooth it looked like glass. The sky above was completely dark, with no stars or moon. The only light came from the train itself, casting a faint glow on the water. Clara shivered. The black sea was beautiful, but it felt wrong. The water didn't move, not even a ripple, and it reflected the darkness above perfectly. It was like a mirror, but deeper, endless. The train doors slid open, but Clara didn't move. She couldn't. The sea felt like it was calling to her, pulling her toward it, but she knew if she stepped outside, she would be lost. She stared at the sea, her breathing shallow. The reflection in the water began to shift, and Clara saw something that made her blood run cold. She saw herself, standing on the shore of the sea, staring back at her. But the reflection wasn't moving like she was. It stood perfectly still, its eyes dark and empty. "No," Clara whispered. "No, no, no." The doors slid shut, and the train started moving again. Clara collapsed back into her seat, her body trembling. She couldn't take much more of this. The hum of the train grew louder, and the whispers returned. They were soft at first, barely audible, but they grew louder with each passing moment. Clara pressed her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. The whispers were inside her head, circling her thoughts. "You can't stay," they said. "You don't belong here." "Then let me leave," Clara shouted, her voice breaking. "Let me off this train." The whispers didn't answer. They faded slowly, leaving Clara in silence again. She slumped in her seat, tears streaming down her face. She was trapped, and she didn't know what to do. The train felt colder now, and the golden lights above flickered more frequently. The seats around her seemed closer together, their shadows stretching across the floor. Clara glanced down the aisle and froze. The door at the far end of the car had reappeared. It was the same plain door, humming softly as if it were waiting for her. Clara stared at it, her chest tightening. She didn't want to go near it again, but she knew she didn't have a choice. The train wasn't going to let her ignore it. Slowly, she stood up and walked toward the door. Her hands shook as she reached out and touched it. The door swung open, and Clara stepped inside. Part 6, The Revelation. Clara stepped through the door. She didn't want to, but it felt like the train wouldn't let her avoid it anymore. Her hands were shaking, and her legs felt weak, but she moved forward. one slow step at a time. Inside the door was another room. It wasn't like the first one with her memories. This room was darker, colder, and emptier. The walls seemed to stretch endlessly, and the floor glowed faintly, just enough for her to see where she was walking. It felt like stepping into nothingness. Clara looked around, her voice trembling as she called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" Her voice echoed, bouncing off invisible walls. No one answered. As Clara moved further into the room, shapes began to appear. At first, they were faint, almost like shadows, but they grew clearer as she got closer. They were figures, people standing perfectly still, lined up in rows. Each figure stood with its head slightly bowed, its face hidden. Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Who are you?" she whispered. The figures didn't move. She stepped closer to one of them, her heart pounding. The figure looked human, but its skin was pale, almost translucent. Its body didn't seem real. It was there, but not solid, like it could disappear at any moment. Clara reached out slowly, her hand trembling, and touched its arm. It was cold. Not cold like ice, but empty, like touching air that had no warmth at all. She pulled her hand back quickly, her chest tight with fear. Clara looked around and realized the room was full of these figures, row after row of them, standing in perfect silence. There were so many of them, too many to count. They filled the endless space, their pale bodies glowing faintly in the dim light. She turned back toward the door, but it was gone. The opening she had walked through was no longer there. Clara felt panic rising in her chest. "No," she whispered. "I want to go back." The figures didn't react. They stood still, their heads bowed, their silence pressing down on her like a heavy weight. Clara backed away, her breathing quick and shallow. "What is this place?" she said, her voice cracking. The room was silent at first, but then the whispers started again. They weren't coming from the walls this time. They were coming from the figures. The sound was soft at first, like wind moving through leaves, but it grew louder, surrounding her. "You're here now," the voices said. Clara's eyes widened. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I'm not staying here. I don't belong here." The figures didn't move, but their whispers filled the room. "We didn't belong either," they said, "but now we do." Clara's stomach churned. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. The whispers didn't answer her question directly. Instead, they said, "The train chooses." Clara shook her head. "No, I chose to get on the train. I can leave if I want to." The figures were silent for a moment, and then the whispers returned, softer this time. "There is no leaving." Clara turned in circles, searching for an exit, but the room stretched endlessly in all directions. The whispers grew softer, fading into the background, but Clara felt their weight, like they were still watching her. In the distance, she saw something new, a large mirror standing alone. It glowed faintly, its surface smooth and clear. Clara hesitated, but she felt drawn to it, as though it were calling her silently. She stepped closer, her hands trembling at her sides. When she reached the mirror, she looked into it and froze. The reflection wasn't what she expected. It showed her sitting in the train, staring out the window, her face pale and her eyes empty. She was still and silent, just like the other figures in the room. "No," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "That's not me." She reached out and touched the mirror. The reflection didn't move like her. It stayed still, staring blankly back at her. Tears filled her eyes. "I'm not like them," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm not one of them." The mirror changed. The reflection of her faded, replaced by an image of the train itself. Clara saw it moving through the black void, its glowing windows shining faintly in the darkness. The train looked empty, silent, lifeless. But as she stared at the image, she realized something. The train wasn't just moving through the void. It was part of it. The train wasn't taking her anywhere. It was collecting her. The figures in the room were passengers. They had been on the train just like her, and now they were part of it. The train had taken them, and it was going to take her too. "No," Clara said, stepping back from the mirror. "This isn't real. It's not real." The mirror flickered, and her reflection returned. but now it was standing still, just like the other figures. Clara backed away, her chest tight, her breathing quick. The door reappeared behind her, and Clara turned toward it. She ran, her heart racing, and pushed it open. She stumbled back into the train car, gasping for air. The train was moving again, gliding smoothly through the dark void. Clara collapsed into her seat, her hands shaking. The golden lights flickered above her, casting soft shadows across the empty car. She stared out the window, her mind spinning. She couldn't leave. The train wouldn't let her, and now she knew the truth. The train wasn't just a vehicle. It was alive. It was collecting passengers, turning them into part of itself, and Clara was next. Clara sat still, staring out the window. The darkness outside didn't change, but she felt its weight pressing down on her. The hum of the train grew louder, almost like a heartbeat, steady and cold. The door to the strange room had disappeared again, but Clara knew it would come back. The train wasn't done with her yet. She leaned back in her seat, her hands gripping the armrests tightly. The whispers were gone now, replaced by silence. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy, final. Clara closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. She didn't know how much time she had left, but she knew one thing. The train wasn't taking her anywhere. It was taking her. Part 7, the final stop. Clara sat in her seat, gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. The train moved smoothly through the dark void, but the hum of its engine felt heavier now, deeper, like it was echoing inside her chest. She had stopped trying to understand what was happening. Nothing made sense anymore, and every breath felt harder to take. The door to the strange room was gone, but Clara couldn't stop thinking about it. The pale figures, the whispers, the mirror. The train wasn't taking her anywhere. It was keeping her, and she didn't know how to stop it. The train began to slow. Clara's stomach dropped. She stared out the window, dreading what she might see. At first it was just darkness, the same endless void as before, but then faint shapes began to appear. The train pulled into its final stop. Clara didn't know how she knew it was the last stop. It just felt different. The air around her grew colder, and the hum of the train faded into silence. Outside the window was a platform, but it wasn't like any platform Clara had ever seen. It was made of smooth black stone, and it stretched out into the darkness like a bridge to nowhere. Small lights floated above the platform, flickering softly, their glow cold and distant. The train doors slid open. Cold air rushed in, and Clara shivered. She didn't want to move. She didn't want to leave her seat. But something deep inside her told her she didn't have a choice. Clara stood slowly, her legs weak. She felt like she was moving in a dream, her body heavy and slow. The open doors seemed to pull her toward them, and she stepped forward, one shaky step at a time. When she stepped onto the platform, the cold air hit her like a wave. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stay warm, but it didn't help. The platform stretched out ahead of her, its surface smooth and black, reflecting the faint lights above. There was nothing else. No buildings, no sounds, no signs of life. Clara turned to look back at the train, but her heart sank. The doors had closed, and the train was already moving away. It glided silently into the darkness, its glowing windows disappearing one by one until it was gone. She was alone. Clara stared at the empty platform, her chest tight. She didn't know where to go, but there was only one path, a narrow bridge that stretched out into the darkness. She couldn't see where it led. It just disappeared into the void. The small lights above flickered, casting faint shadows across the platform. Clara took a deep breath and started walking. The bridge felt solid under her feet, but the darkness around her pressed in, making her feel small and lost. Every step felt harder than the last. The air grew heavier, colder, and her legs felt like they might give out. But she kept moving, her eyes fixed on the faint lights ahead. As Clara walked, shapes began to appear on the bridge. At first, they were shadows, barely visible in the dim light. But as she got closer, they became clearer. They were figures, pale and still, just like the ones she had seen in the strange room. Clara's heart raced. The figures stood in a line on either side of the bridge, their heads bowed, their bodies glowing faintly. She stopped, her breath coming in short gasps. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." The figures didn't move, but their presence was overwhelming. Clara felt their gaze, even though their heads were bowed. It was like they were waiting for her, watching her. "Why me?" she said aloud, her voice breaking. "Why is this happening to me?" The figures didn't answer. They just stood there, silent and cold. Clara kept walking, even though her legs felt like they might collapse. The figures grew thicker, lining both sides of the bridge. Their silence was deafening, and the cold around them seeped into her bones. Finally, she reached the end of the bridge. Ahead of her was nothing but darkness. The small lights above her flickered and went out, leaving her standing in total blackness. For a moment there was silence. Then the whisper came. "You are here now," the voice said. It was soft, quiet, but it filled the darkness around her. Clara's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the bridge. "No," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I don't belong here. Let me go." The whisper was calm, unfeeling. "You don't leave," it said. "No one leaves." Clara felt the cold creeping up her body, starting at her feet and moving slowly upward. She tried to stand, but she couldn't move. Her body felt heavy, like it wasn't hers anymore. She looked down at her hands and gasped. They were pale, glowing faintly, just like the figures on the bridge. Her fingers trembled as the glow spread, covering her arms, her chest, her legs. "No," she whispered, "this isn't real. It's not real." But it was. The cold reached her head and her vision blurred. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the line of figures, still and silent, standing on the bridge. And then she was one of them. The train reappeared, gliding silently through the darkness. Its glowing windows lit up the platform as it slowed to a stop. The doors slid open, and the faint hum of the engine filled the air. A new passenger stepped onto the platform, looking confused and scared. They hesitated for a moment, then stepped onto the train. The doors closed, and the train moved on, disappearing into the void. The figures on the bridge didn't move. They stood silently, their heads bowed, waiting for the next arrival.